Today's reading comes from Daniel chapter 5, and it's titled The Writing on the Wall. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them also. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, and of bronze, of iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in all of the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. His nobles were baffled. Now the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams and to explain riddles and to solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles that my father king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom." The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king, and I will tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death, and those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and to your nobles, and to your wives and your concubines drank from them. You praise the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which you cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel and Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene means God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, and a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Thank you, Lord, for your word.
Good morning. My name's Katie. It's lovely to meet those of you who I don't know, and lovely to see lots of friendly faces as well. So, Patrick very kindly let me choose in this series which talk I'd like to do. And I chose this one partly because I've largely always worked for organisations that campaign for social change. But more importantly, this idea is what excites me most about my faith. A God of justice, a God who seeks to repair, to reconcile, who looks for repentance, reparation and renewal. The idea that there is a better world and we are part of making it so as God's people. So we're going to look at 3 different themes this morning. The fact that God is in charge, the fact that God's truth is for everyone, and the fact that God's power doesn't always look like our power. And I put it in that order because it kind of goes with speak truth, power. But in reality, we're going to do the first one first, the second one third, and the third one second. So just to keep you on your toes. So just in case you didn't believe me, here's 3 generations of my family at a Christian Aid Climate Justice March. So this phrase, speaking truth to power, now, it doesn't come direct from the Bible, but it does come direct from the church. Now, the phrase speak truth to power originated with the American Society of Friends, or the American Quakers, in the 50s. And it was popularized by a pamphlet that was called Speak Truth to Power, and about a search for an alternative to violence. Now, the pamphlet, published by the American Friends Service Committee, advocated for non-violence and challenged the assumptions of military power. But even before that pamphlet was produced, the concept of speaking truth to power was discussed by various individuals and groups, including this guy that you see, Bayard, I've lost his surname now, Bayard Rustin, thank you, who in 1942 wrote about the primary social function of a religious society as speaking truth to power. Now, in the 20th century, the phrase gained further prominence through its association with both the civil rights protest movements and also peace movements. And like the prophets of the Old Testament, people like the Reverend Martin Luther King grounded their words and action in love and justice, not as opposites, but as necessary companions. And this quote is attributed to Martin Luther King. Power without love is reckless, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And I know for some of us, the idea of power, particularly power that we have or we might use, can seem uncomfortable. But it's important to remember that it's not an opposite to love, but an important companion. Now, in 2008, the phrase was repopularized again by a lady called Kerry Kennedy, who was then president of the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Association. And she wrote a book called Speak Truth to Power. And that focused on uplifting human rights defenders from around the world who were speaking their truth, often at great personal risk. And the phrase is widely used now, certainly in my job and the things in the work that I do and the people I encounter, but in human rights activism and politics to represent speaking out to people in positions of authority. So while it's not the exclusive domain of the church or indeed faith organisations, at her best, the church has stood alongside, if not catalysed, the major anti-oppression movements of our time by speaking truth to power. So, God is in charge. Now, we're going to use this definition this morning. It's quite small up there, but we'll see it again in other places of what speaking truth to power means. So it's about standing up for what's right, speaking out against injustice, even when it's difficult or potentially dangerous, especially when addressing those in authority. And it involves confronting powerful individuals or systems with uncomfortable truths, often with the aim of challenging unjust or harmful practices. So how does it apply to our passage? So King Belteshazzar, and thank you, Jason, it was a long reading, appreciate you going all the way to the end, son of Nebuchadnezzar, who brought Daniel to Babylon, is showing off his wealth and his power, and choosing to do so with the precious and sacred temple equipment. And now in the midst of the revelry, some magic fingers appear. Now, we're not actually going to spend too long thinking about magic fingers because I don't understand them, but some magic fingers appear and they write a message on the wall. And the king is understandably afraid. And immediately he exerts his power and wealth to demand that the wise men gives him an answer. He offers status. He offers a purple robe. Just give me the answer. Just calm my fears. But they couldn't. All these enchanters and wise men couldn't crack it. And I do find it slightly ironic that then the wife steps in and go, have you thought about Daniel? So Daniel appears, and this is how he responds. So first of all, standing up for what's right and speaking out against injustice. Now, what's quite interesting about Daniel, when we've done 6 chapters now, is that despite him being forcibly removed from his home of Judah, he rarely speaks to the various kings about injustice. If you read the other books of the prophets, you hear them railing and screaming against the way the poor are treated, the widows and the orphans, around unfair trade deals and kings usurping their power. There's one exception in Daniel in the first 6 chapters, which is 4 verse 27, where he says, "Therefore, your majesty," this is to King Nebuchadnezzar, "be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be then that your prosperity will continue." The main message of Daniel when he speaks is about where the power really lies, and that despite appearances, God is in charge. Now, throughout the chapters, we've also seen all sorts of expressions of human power, fear and intimidation. Do you remember the massive gold statue, 90 foot, was it, that Nebuchadnezzar built? The king has used the law, the police, fire, lions. But in each case, God is revealed and recognized, in the words of Nebuchadnezzar, as the God of gods and the Lord of kings. Daniel's message about standing up for what is right is about a right relationship with God, and he literally stands up in front of the king. So what about this bit? Even when it's difficult or potentially dangerous, well, I don't think this is hard to associate it with the experience of Daniel and his friends. They had their execution ordered, they were thrown into blazing furnaces, and of course, they had to hang out overnight with lions. What about addressing those in authority? Well, in this situation, Daniel and his friends are often invited into the presence of the king. And they're able to speak directly, both to the king, but also to the audience, all the courtiers and all the officials of those around. Clearly, King Belshazzar's wife knew of Daniel, so it wasn't just a case of a one-on-one little meeting. When Daniel spoke, he spoke to a wider audience, not just the king in authority. And let's remember, he was equipped both by God to do it. We remember Daniel praying for the interpretation of dreams, but also by his training. He was nobility. He was trained in the courts. He was equipped to speak. Confronting powerful individuals or systems with uncomfortable truths. So, for King Belshazzar, like his father, his heart has become arrogant and hardened with pride. Daniel says this, "You have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven, and God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end." That feels quite uncomfortable. "You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." Not an easy thing to say in front of a king, particularly one who was petrified and probably not in a very rational frame of mind. And lastly, often with the aim of challenging unjust or harmful practices. As we heard in the chapter, Daniel calls out the fact that you praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze and iron, of wood and stone, which cannot even see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. In this case, there's no time for King Belshazzar to change his ways or to adjust his behaviors. Unlike his father, Nebuchadnezzar, he had 7 years as a donkey to work things out. But those watching on hopefully took note. So next I want us to think a little bit about this. God's power does not look like our power. When God chooses to partner with his people to speak truth to power, a strange pattern emerges. The kings of Babylon are not confronted by a leader of equal or greater military might or wealth and power knocking on the door with trumpets demanding to be heard. God chooses Daniel and his friends, a forced immigrant of a conquered people. So, what examples can you think of from the Bible of speaking and acting in a way that models this pattern, where God chooses something or someone unexpected to speak truth to power? And if you're brave enough, you could even say it out loud. Jonah, thank you. Anybody else? David, yes, he was like the last son, wasn't he, of Jesse? Thought of so little value that Jesse didn't even call him in from the fields when the prophet Samuel came. Yeah. St. Paul, yeah, that atrocious murderer, suddenly became the founder of the Church of the Gentiles. Yeah. Mary, amazing, yeah, an unmarried peasant. And Joseph as well, who became the parents of Jesus. One more? Moses, a guy with a stutter, also prone to a bit of violence, an old man, a shepherd, who went and asked for Pharaoh to set God's people free. And we're reminded, aren't we, in this verse from Corinthians, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world, the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. And I just wanted to share a little bit of my own experience, because this is something that I've found quite difficult, and I just wonder if this is helpful for anyone else. And I found, partly maybe due to my age, but also partly because I'm a girl, that sometimes I've really struggled to have the skills and talents and my desire for leadership recognised. Sometimes in the church, sometimes at work. And so the idea that I'm weak and foolish, I've struggled with, because I was fighting at the same time to find my space. And so I really struggled with this. And it's a journey that I'm on, I guess, to understand that in God's presence, of course, I'm weak and foolish. But I just wanted to share that as it's a bit of a battle sometimes to get that priority right for me because of some of the situations and experiences that I've had. But God is gracious and gentle in the way that he teaches. I love this quote as well from Father Richard Rohr. And I'm just reminded as we look at the picture of that cross, in every case, we are presented with some form of powerlessness. And from that situation, God creates a new form of power. Nowhere is this more dramatic than in the mind-blowing image of the cross, where the hands that forge stars, we sang that, didn't we, this morning already, are pinned with cruel nails. Victory for all the world looks like a humiliating defeat, as the power of Christ meets the demand of justice to correct everything that stands against love. Now, standing up for what is right and speaking against injustice is not always just about words. And I wanted to share this story from more modern times. This is a photo of the silent parade in 1917 that some of you may be aware of. And this was to bring attention to the discrimination and violence faced by African Americans. So 10,000 black people marched down Fifth Avenue in the heat of July 1917. They were led by children dressed in white, then the women, then all the others. There were no songs, no chants or megaphones, just the sound of them, their steps, their breath, the soft vibrations of muffled drums holding together their steps. And this would become known as the Silent Parade. And this followed a number of events, but in particular, the East St. Louis race riot, in which a crowd of white residents shot, hanged, and burned hundreds of black people and their homes. What a contrast. Our power does not look like your power. The power to fight injustice shows up in unexpected places, on the lips of schoolgirls like Greta Thunberg demanding climate justice, or Malala Yousafzai risking her life for human rights and the education of women in Pakistan. Speaking truth to power is not just for Bible heroes. So what about us? How should we stand up for what is right and speak out against injustice? Where is the power in our society that needs to be challenged? What options do we have? Is it dangerous or difficult to do so? What gets in our way? Which authorities are we to address? Governments, institutions, work, universities, school, church, businesses, corporations? How should we confront powerful individuals or systems with uncomfortable truths? And where do we see unjust or harmful practices that should be challenged? Now, today, I want us to consider just one injustice that is happening on our watch, and that's the humanitarian crisis in Palestine. Now, on your tables, if you're near a table, if you're not, there's plenty scattered around, you'll find a little dove like this. So this is not just for the second service. And as we continue the service this morning, I'd love to invite you to colour and just reflect on what you're hearing, or to add a prayer for peace. And I've chosen to focus on Palestine, but there are many other conflicts in the world you might wish to think about. And I've chosen to, so what we'll do, if you want to, we'll collect these doves up the front, and then we're going to send them to the authorities. We're going to send a letter to our MP. And I've chosen to put these words in the letter. And these come from Embrace the Middle East, which is a Christian charity. And I'll read them out to you. And if you feel comfortable, then you can add your dove to that letter. If you don't, that's okay. And what it's going to say is this: the UK government should immediately suspend all arms sales to Israel, continue pressing for a full lifting of the aid blockade, and recognise that Israel's actions have breached international law. As a Christian, I believe it is my duty to appeal to those in positions of authority to do what is right. Therefore, I appeal to you to do what is right and stand on the side of justice. We've all seen images that break hearts of Jews, of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Muslims, of Christians, of families fractured, broken by this appalling violence. So our last section this morning is about truth. We've talked about power and speaking up, and now we're just going to consider truth. In Acts 28:25, Paul says that the Holy Spirit spoke the truth to your ancestors through the prophets. Jesus says in John 15, if you love me, you will obey what I command, and I will ask the Father, and he will give you another counselor to be with you forever, the Spirit of truth. Now, we can find it really difficult these days to work out where the truth lies. We can get deflated by fake news or clever lies. But let's not forget, we have the Spirit of truth within us. We can ask for the gift of discernment to see where God's truth lies. And just in case we see no familiarity with the truth that King Belshazzar heard from Daniel, we can turn to Jesus' words in Luke. Jesus, who, as it says in the Bible, came into the world to testify the truth. In fact, he says that to Pilate in his trial. So this is a passage from Luke 12:16-21. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded abundant harvests. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. There I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. Here Jesus is not speaking about a king. His parable is about a farmer, a businessman, a landowner, who is also reveling in his success, showing off his wealth with bigger barns, celebrating with wine and food and merriment. He sees himself as a self-made man. His success fuels greed for more. There's no charity or humility. And like King Belshazzar, he is humbled. God takes everything in one night. Now, perhaps when we hear rich man, we think of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. But remember, those of you who were at my sermon in November, that the majority of people that Jesus was speaking to were in the peasant class, that brown line at the bottom. And this was a little graphic we had in November of how society was split up in Jesus' time. The majority of people were tenant farmers. They didn't own their land. Now, I can't speak for many of you, but I am not in that brown line. I am a landowner. I'm a gardener, not a farmer. I'm an employee. In the grand scheme of things, I am rich. This parable is just as true for me as the words of Daniel were for King Belshazzar and Nebuchadnezzar. God is in charge. My privilege and position are not as a result of my own goodness or genius or hard work. I need to get in line with Daniel as he prays in chapter 2, praise be to the name of the God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and disposes them. God is in charge, and his rule is one of justice and mercy. Compared to God, I am the foolish. I am the weak, the lowly, in order that I might not boast with barns or temple cups. When God speaks truth to power, that truth is for all of us. And this is great news. And I want to leave us with one more quote this morning. And this is by the late, great Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He says this: "During the darkest days of apartheid, I used to say that we had already won. All the objectives facts were against us. The pass laws, the imprisonments, the tear gassing, the massacres, the murder of political activists. But my confidence was not in the present circumstances, but in the laws of God's universe. Despite all the evidence that seems to be the contrary, there is no way that evil and injustice and oppression and lies can have the last word. God is a God who cares about justice and injustice. God is in charge." And it would be so lovely to end there, wouldn't it? It'd be so lovely to end on that victorious note. God is in charge. And I do believe that with all my heart. But I think it's really important just to add the last bit of the quote from Desmond Tutu, his prayer. "Of course, there are times when you had to whisper in the dark to keep your morale up, and you wanted to whisper in God's ear, 'God, we know you are in charge, but can't you make it a little more obvious?'"